In the frozen wilderness of Wyoming, 1887, a simple act of kindness is about to change two lives forever. Luke Callahan, a weathered cowboy barely scraping by on his remote homestead, discovers a young woman collapsed in a snowdrift outside his cabin door. Half dead from the bitter cold, she's running from something or someone. He doesn't ask questions. He simply carries her inside, tends to her fever, and nurses her back to health through the long winter months. What Luke doesn't know is that the mysterious woman warming herself by his fire is Clara Beaumont, heir to the largest gold fortune in the American West. She's fled an arranged marriage to a cruel businessman, leaving behind unimaginable wealth for a chance at freedom. As spring approaches and their bond deepens, Luke makes a decision that will shake the foundations of everything they both believe about love, loyalty, and sacrifice. But when her true identity is revealed, will their love survive the storm that follows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a banshee across the Wyoming territory, rattling the shutters of Luke Callahan's modest cabin with a vengeance that spoke of winter's final, desperate grip on the land. Inside, the warmth of the stone fireplace cast dancing shadows across weathered wooden walls, where the scent of pine smoke mingled with the aroma of strong coffee and beans simmering in an iron pot. Luke stood at the frosted window, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming tin cup, watching the snow fall in thick, relentless sheets. At 32, he carried the look of a man who had learned life's lessons, the hard, way-broad shoulders that had borne more than their share of burden. Hands that knew both the weight of an axe and the gentleness required to tend a wounded animal, and eyes the color of weathered denim that held depths of quiet wisdom. The woman lying in his bed stirred slightly, drawing his attention back to the present. 3 days had passed since he'd found her half buried in the snow, clutching a torn horseshoe that had somehow broken free from her horse's hoof. That horseshoe now sat on his mantelpiece, a reminder of the moment fate had dropped this mystery into his solitary life. She was a delicate thing, or so she appeared in her weakened state. Her dark hair spread across his pillow like spilled ink, and her face, though pale from her ordeal, held a refinement that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn cabin. Her hands, he'd noticed when tending to her, were too soft for someone who claimed to work as a governess, though that was what she'd whispered during her feverish mumblings. "Water," came a weak voice from the bed. Luke set down his cup and crossed to her side, lifting her head gently to help her drink from the tin cup. Her eyes fluttered open green as spring grass, and far more alert than they'd been since he'd found her. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice carrying an accent that spoke of education and refinement. "My cabin, about 15 miles north of Cheyenne." Luke replied, his voice naturally soft and measured. "You've been unconscious for 3 days, found you in the snow during that last storm." She attempted to sit up, but Luke's gentle hand on her shoulder kept her still. "Easy now. You took quite a beating from the cold. Need to take things slow." "I'm Clara," she said, her eyes searching his face. "Clara. Mason." The pause before her surname was so brief that most men might have missed it, but Luke had learned to read the subtle signs that spoke of hidden truths. Still, he simply nodded. "Luke Callahan. This is my spread, not much to look at, but it's home." Clara's eyes took in the cabin's interior, the rough-hewn furniture that showed the marks of careful craftsmanship, the neatly organized shelves lined with books that surprised her, and the sense of order that spoke of a man who took pride in his simple life. Hidden in her travel bag beneath the bed lay her torn wedding dress, the elaborate silk and lace creation that had cost more than most men earned in a year. She'd ripped it deliberately before her escape, symbolic of the life she was leaving behind. "How did you come to be out there in the storm?" Luke asked, settling into a chair beside the bed. Clara's mind raced, crafting the story she'd rehearsed during her flight from San Francisco. "I was working as a governess for a family in Denver, the man of the house. He became inappropriate. I had to leave quickly. The lie came easier than she'd expected, built around enough truth to make it believable. Luke's jaw tightened slightly. Man like that deserves a good thrashing. You did right to leave. I was trying to reach my cousin in Cheyenne when the storm hit. My horse threw me and ran off. At least that part was true, though she omitted that the horse had been worth more than Luke's entire homestead. Lucky you made it as far as you did. That storm killed 3 men in town. Luke stood and walked to the stove, ladling beans into a bowl. You need to get some food in you. Been living on water and broth for days. As he brought her the simple meal, Clara noticed the gentle way he moved, the consideration in his actions. So different from the men she'd known in her previous lifemen, who saw her as either a business opportunity or a prize to be won. Here was someone who'd saved her life expecting nothing in return. "You live here alone?" she asked, accepting the bowl gratefully. "Just me and my horses. Had a dog until last spring, old Blue." He was good company. Luke settled back into his chair, watching her eat with the satisfaction of a man who'd done right by someone in need. It must get lonely. Man gets used to his own company. Besides, there's plenty to keep busy with. Ranch doesn't run itself. He gestured toward the window. "Come spring, I've got to repair the north fence, break in a new colt, and get the vegetable garden started. Always something." Clara found herself genuinely interested in his simple life. In her world, people paid others to handle such tasks. Here was a man who built his life with his own hands, who found satisfaction in work well done rather than profit margins and social climbing. "What about you?" Luke asked. "Got family somewhere worrying about you?" The question struck closer to home than he could know. At this very moment, her father was probably mobilizing half the Pinkerton detective agency to find her. Her arranged fiancé, Charles Morrison, was likely pressuring politicians and lawmen from California to Colorado. The thought of their collective fury when they discovered her gone made her stomach clench with anxiety. "No one who would truly miss me," she said, which was painfully true despite her wealth and social position. Luke studied her face, seeing something that spoke of deeper pain than just the physical hardships she'd endured. "Well, you're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel. Spring's still a ways off, and traveling alone in this territory isn't safe for anyone, especially a woman." "I couldn't impose." "No imposition. Got plenty of room, and I could use the company. Been talking to the horses so long, they probably think I'm touched in the head." Clara found herself smiling for the first time in months. "You're very kind, Mr. Callahan." "Just Luke, and kindness has got nothing to do with it. Man does what's right, or he's not much of a man at all." Over the following days, as Clara regained her strength, she found herself drawn into the rhythm of Luke's life. He woke before dawn to tend the horses, checking on each animal with the care of a father watching over his children. He chopped wood with methodical precision, each swing of the axe deliberate and sure. He cooked simple meals that tasted better than the elaborate dishes she'd grown up with, seasoned with the satisfaction of honest work and shared conversation. She began to help where she could carefully at first, claiming governess duties had taught her household skills. In truth, she was learning as she went, but Luke's patient guidance and her own determination carried her through. Her hands, soft from a life of privilege, began to show the small calluses that came from useful work. "You're a quick learner," Luke observed one evening as they sat by the fire, she mending one of his shirts while he worked on a piece of leather tack. "I've had good teachers," Clara replied, meaning it more than he could know. "That family in Denver, they treat you well, aside from the trouble with the man." Clara's fingers stilled on the needle. "The children were sweet. I'll miss them." Another carefully crafted truth. She had once spent an afternoon with her business partner's children and had been charmed by their innocence. "You'd make a good mother," Luke said quietly, then colored slightly as if surprised by his own words. Clara felt her heart skip. In her world, motherhood was discussed in terms of heirs and social obligations. Here was a man who spoke of it as a calling, a gift. "What makes you say that?" "The way you handle things. Patient. Gentle when it's called for, but firm when needed." Saw you with that injured bird. Yesterday took time to set its wing proper, didn't just put it out of its misery. She remembered the small sparrow she'd found with a broken wing, how she'd carefully splintered it while Luke watched approvingly. In her former life, she would have had a servant deal with such things. Here, she'd acted on instinct, on a compassion she didn't know she possessed. "I've never really thought about children," she admitted, though the lie sat heavy on her tongue. She'd thought about little else since her engagement, dreading the prospect of bearing Charles Morrison's children, of raising them in a world where love took second place to advantage. "Well, you're still young. Time enough for that later." Clara looked at Luke across the firelight, seeing the way his eyes softened when he spoke of family, of the future. Here was a man who would love his children, not for what they could bring him, but simply because they were his. The realization stirred something deep in her chest, a longing she'd never allowed herself to feel. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you want children?" Luke set down his work and stared into the fire for a long moment. "Always figured I would, someday. But a man in my situation, well, it's not easy to find a woman willing to share this kind of life. Most women want more than I can offer." "What can you offer?" He looked at her then, his blue eyes serious. "Honest work, a roof that doesn't leak, food on the table every day, though it might not be fancy, protection from whatever troubles come along. And," he paused, as if weighing his words carefully, "and a man who'd never raise his hand to her, never look at another woman, never give her cause to doubt she was treasured." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. In her world, she'd been offered wealth, status, power, everything, except the simple treasures Luke spoke of with such quiet conviction. "That sounds like more than most women ever get," she said softly. "Maybe, but it's not much compared to what a man with real means could provide. Money isn't everything, Luke." He smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features. "Easy to say, when you've never gone without. I've seen lean times, Clara. Times when I wondered if I'd make it through the winter. Not much romance in an empty belly." If only he knew, Clara thought, that she'd had everything money could buy and found it emptier than any hunger. But she couldn't say that without revealing too much of herself. "I think you underestimate what you have to offer," she said instead. Luke's eyes met hers across the flickering firelight, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibilities neither was ready to name. Then a log settled in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney, and the moment passed. "Better get some rest," Luke said, standing and banking the fire. "Tomorrow's supposed to be clear. Thought I'd take you around the property if you're feeling up to it." Clara nodded, watching him prepare for bed with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to solitude. But as she settled under the quilts he'd given her, she found herself wondering what it would be like to share not just his cabin, but his life. The thought should have frightened Hershey, who had been raised to expect servants and luxury. Instead, it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the dying fire. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song across the Wyoming wilderness, but inside the cabin, two hearts were beginning to beat in rhythm with something neither quite understood yet. Clara's hand found the simple wooden comb Luke had carved for her, running her fingers over its smooth surface. Such a small thing, yet it represented more genuine affection than all the expensive gifts she'd ever received. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn about this man who had saved her life. But tonight, for the first time in months, Clara Beaumont fell asleep without nightmares of golden cages and loveless marriages, dreaming, instead of a future where the size of a man's heart mattered more than the size of his bank account. The morning brought a deceptive calm that any seasoned frontiersman would have recognized as the breathing space before nature's next assault. Luke stood on his porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the western sky with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to read the language of weather. The air carried that peculiar stillness that preceded the worst storms, and the horses in the corral paced restlessly, their instincts warning them of what was coming. "Storm's building," he called to Clara, who was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin. "Big one, from the looks of it." Clara paused in her work, a simple cotton dress of his mother's, in her hands. Over the past week, she'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of frontier life, finding unexpected satisfaction in tasks that would have been handled by servants in her previous existence. How can you tell? Horses know, winds shifting, and see that line of clouds building in the west. That's trouble coming our way. Luke drained his cup and set it on the porch rail. We need to get everything secured. This one's going to be a fighter. They spent the morning preparing for the storm's arrival. Luke brought extra wood into the cabin, enough to last several days, while Clara helped him secure the shutters and check the roof for any loose boards that might give way under the weight of snow. She moved with a competence that continued to surprise him. Her hands might be soft, but they were skilled and willing. "Where did you learn to tie knots like that?" Luke asked, watching her secure a rope with the efficiency of someone who'd done it many times before. Clara's hands stilled for a moment. She'd learned from the crew of her father's yacht, but she couldn't say that. "My father was a sailor," she said instead, which was true enough, though he'd owned the ships rather than worked them. Good man to have around in a storm, I'd wager. "He was," Clara replied softly, thinking of her father not as the ruthless businessman others knew, but as the man who had once taught her to read the stars and told her bedtime stories of far-off places. By afternoon, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, and within an hour, the storm Luke had predicted was upon them with a fury that made Clara's previous experience seem like a gentle spring shower. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, seeking entry through every gap and crevice. Snow piled against the windows until the world outside disappeared entirely, leaving them isolated in their small circle of warmth and light. "How long do these storms usually last?" Clara asked, watching Luke bank the fire for the night. "This one could be 3 days, maybe 4. We're well supplied, though. No need to worry." But Clara was worried, though not about the storm. Being trapped in close quarters with Luke was awakening feelings she'd never experienced before. She found herself watching the way his hands moved as he worked, noting the gentle way he spoke to the horses when he went out to check on them, remembering the sound of his quiet laughter when she'd made a particularly poor attempt at cooking biscuits. On the second day of the storm, Clara made a mistake that nearly shattered the carefully constructed story she'd built around herself. She was examining her few possessions while Luke was outside, tending to the animals, when her fingers found the small velvet pouch she'd hidden in the lining of her traveling bag. Inside was her family's signet ringer heavy gold band, bearing the Beaumont coat of arms, worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. She'd kept it as a reminder of who she was, unable to completely sever all ties to her past. Now, turning it over in her hands, she felt the weight of her deception pressing down upon her. The ring represented everything she'd been running from: duty, obligation, a life mapped out by others. But it also represented security, power, the ability to help Luke in ways he couldn't imagine. "What's that?" Luke's voice from the doorway made her jump. She hadn't heard him come back inside, and now he stood there, snow still clinging to his coat, looking at the ring in her hands with curious eyes. It belonged to my mother," Clara said, slipping it quickly onto her finger. "The only thing I have left of her." Luke crossed the room, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. "May I?" Clara extended her hand reluctantly, watching his face as he examined the ring. His thumb traced the intricate carving of the coat of arms, and she saw the moment recognition flickered in his eyes. "This is fine work," he said carefully. "Your mother's family must have been well situated." "They were comfortable," Clara replied, the understatement burning her tongue. Luke released her hand, but his eyes remained thoughtful. "That's the Beaumont family crest, isn't it?" Clara's heart stopped. I wouldn't know. It was just something my mother wore. Saw it once in a newspaper. Article about the mining heiress, Clara Beaumont. Richest woman in the West, they said. Luke's voice was casual, but Clara could hear the undercurrent of suspicion. Funny coincidence, sharing a name and having her family's ring. "Coincidences happen," Clara said, but her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. Luke nodded slowly, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind. Indeed they do. The rest of the day passed in a subtle tension that hadn't existed before. Luke went about his usual tasks, but Clara caught him watching her with new eyes, noting things he'd previously overlooked. When she automatically reached for the more expensive tea instead of the common variety, when she used a phrase more suited to a drawing room than a frontier cabin, when she displayed knowledge of business matters that no governess should possess. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara decided to address the elephant in the room. "You think I'm lying to you?" Luke was quiet for a long moment, whittling a piece of wood with steady, precise strokes. "I think everyone's got secrets, Clara. Question is whether those secrets are the kind that hurt people." "What if they are?" "Then I reckon that depends on who's getting hurt, and why." Clara stared into the fire, seeing her future playing out in the dancing flames. "What if I told you I wasn't who you think I am?" "I'd say I already figured that out. Woman doesn't survive what you've survived, doesn't know what you know, doesn't carry herself the way you do without having lived a different kind of life than the one you've described. And that doesn't bother you?" Luke set down his whittling and looked at her directly. "What bothers me is that you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth. But I figure you've got your reasons, and when you're ready to share them, you will." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You're too good, Luke Callahan." "No," he said softly. "I'm just a man who's learned that everyone deserves a chance to be who they choose to be, regardless of who they were before." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. Clara felt the weight of her deception more keenly now, but she also felt the warmth of Luke's acceptance, his willingness to wait for her truth rather than demand it. "The family I worked for in Denver," she said slowly. They weren't good people. I saw things, learned things that made me understand how different life could be. I wanted to be someone else, someone better. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was more truth than she'd given anyone in months." Luke nodded. "Sometimes a person needs to leave one life behind to find the one they're meant to live." "Is that what you did?" "In a way, I was born to different circumstances than what I have now. But I chose this life, chose to make something of my own rather than live on what others had built." Clara wondered what he meant by that, but before she could ask, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the roof. Luke was on his feet instantly, grabbing his coat and heading for the door. "Stay inside," he called over his shoulder. "Tree branch probably came down." But Clara couldn't sit still. She pulled on her borrowed coat and followed him into the storm, immediately regretting the decision as the wind and snow hit her like a physical blow. Luke was already climbing onto the roof, examining the damage by the light of his lantern. "How bad is it?" she called up to him. "Not too bad. Branch punched a hole, but I can patch it." He started to climb down, then slipped on the icy roof. Clara watched in horror as Luke fell, landing hard in the snow, with a grunt of pain. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees beside him. "Luke, are you hurt?" He tried to sit up, then fell back with a grimace. "My shoulder. Think I might have dislocated it." Without thinking, Clara took charge. "Don't move. I need to examine it." Her hands moved over his shoulder with practiced skill, probing gently but thoroughly. "It's dislocated, but I can set it. I'll need to get you inside first." "How do you know?" "I've done this before," Clara said, helping him to his feet. "Let's get you warm, then I'll take care of the shoulder." Inside the cabin, Clara worked with the confidence of someone who had received the best medical training money could buy. She'd studied with private physicians, learned emergency medicine as part of her comprehensive education. Now, as she carefully manipulated Luke's shoulder back into place, she forgot to maintain her governess persona. "There," she said as the joint popped back into position. "You'll be sore for a few days, but it should heal fine." Luke looked at her with new respect and renewed suspicion. Where exactly did a governess learn to do that? Clara realized her mistake too late. The family I worked for, their son was involved in athletics. I learned some basic medical care." Luke nodded. but she could see he wasn't entirely convinced. "Lucky for me you did." As she helped him secure his arm in a makeshift sling, Clara realized that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Each act of kindness, each moment of competence, each slip into her natural manner was revealing more of her true self. Soon, Luke would piece together the truth, and when he did, everything would change. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, but Clara knew the real storm was just beginning. When Luke discovered who she really was, would he see her as the woman who had shared his cabin and his life, or as the wealthy heiress who had deceived him? The thought of losing his respect, his growing affection, made her heart ache in ways she'd never experienced before. But perhaps it was time for the truth. Perhaps it was time to trust Luke Callahan with her heart, her secrets, and her future. The storm passed on the third day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Luke's shoulder was healing well under Clara's attentive care, though he still favored it when he thought she wasn't looking. The accident had created an intimacy between them that went beyond mere gratitudes. He had seen him vulnerable, and he had witnessed her competence and grace under pressure. As Luke sat in his chair by the fire, Clara noticed him reading from a weathered, leather-bound book. The sight surprised her. She had expected him to be literate, but the book in his hands was clearly something more substantial than a farmer's almanac. "What are you reading?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him with her mending. Luke held up the book, a collection of Shakespeare's plays. "My mother's Bible," he said with a gentle smile. "Not the religious kind, but the book she read to me every night when I was young. She believed a man should know something of beauty and poetry, not just the practical matters of survival." Clara's heart warmed at the image of young Luke, listening to his mother, read the great works of literature. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was, schoolteacher before she married my father. She used to say that a person's circumstances didn't have to define the richness of their inner life. Luke's fingers traced the worn cover with obvious affection. "She died when I was 14, but she made sure I had her books. 23 volumes of everything from Shakespeare to Dickens." "And you've read them all?" "Several times over. Long winter nights give a man plenty of time for reading." Luke's eyes met hers across the firelight. "What about you? What did you read growing up?" Clara had to think carefully about her answer. Her education had been extensive and expensive, including literature from around the world, but she couldn't reveal that. "The usual things, some poetry, a few novels when I could find them." "Tell me about your favorite book." The question caught her off guard. Without thinking, she began to speak about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, describing Elizabeth Bennet's character with the enthusiasm of someone who had studied the work extensively. As she spoke, she noticed Luke's growing attention, the way his eyes sharpened with interest. "You speak of it like you've read it many times," he observed. I suppose I have. It was one of the few books the family owned." Clara felt the familiar weight of her deception settling on her shoulders. Luke nodded, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind. A governess might have access to such books, but the depth of her analysis suggested something more formal: education, time for contemplation, the luxury of rereading for pleasure rather than necessity. The next morning brought clear skies and the first hint that winter might eventually loosen its grip on the land. Luke was outside checking the horses when Clara heard the sound of approaching riders. Her heart clenched with fear. Had they found her already? She peered through the window and saw 3 men on horseback. Their leader, a grizzled older man with a sheriff's badge gleaming on his coat. Behind him rode 2 younger men, both wearing the practical clothes of working ranch hands. Luke emerged from the barn, his good hand resting casually on his hip near his pistol. Clara watched the exchange through the window, unable to hear the words, but reading the body language with growing anxiety. The sheriff was asking questions, and Luke was answering with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to be cautious around authority. After what felt like an eternity, the riders departed, and Luke returned to the cabin with a thoughtful expression. "What did they want?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sheriff Patterson. He's been asking around about a missing woman. Rich family from San Francisco is offering a substantial reward for her safe return. Clara's mouth went dry. What kind of woman? Young, well-educated, traveling alone. Apparently she disappeared from Denver about the same time you showed up here. Luke's eyes studied her face carefully. Interesting coincidence. Did you tell him about me? Luke was quiet for a long moment. I told him I'd been alone all winter. No visitors, no strangers passing through. Clara felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. Why? Because whoever's looking for this woman, they're not doing it out of concern for her welfare. Sheriff Patterson's been bought, and those men with him weren't deputies, they were hired guns. Luke crossed to the window and looked out at the empty horizon. A woman doesn't run from people who love her, Clara. She runs from people who mean her harm. You don't know that, don't I? Luke turned back to her, his blue eyes serious. You flinch every time a horse approaches. You check the windows before you light the lamp at night. You sleep with your hand on the knife I gave you. Those aren't the actions of a woman who's simply changing her circumstances. They're the actions of a woman who's afraid. Clara felt the careful walls she'd built around herself beginning to crumble. What if I told you that you're right, that I am running from people who mean me harm? Then I'd say you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to, and I'd ask what I can do to help. The simple offer, made without conditions or demands for explanation, broke something inside Clara. She found herself crossing the room to stand before him, her hands trembling slightly. You don't understand what you're offering. The people looking for me, they have power, influence. They could destroy your life if they knew you were helping me. Luke reached out and gently took her hands in his. Clara, I've lived through range wars, droughts, and winters that killed weaker men. I've faced down claim jumpers and cattle rustlers. I'm not easily intimidated by power and influence. But I'm not worth the risk. That's where you're wrong. Luke's voice was quiet but firm. Every person deserves the chance to live free from fear. If you're running from something, then you have good reason, and that's enough for me. Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't even know who I am. I know who you are here, in this cabin, in this life we've been sharing. I know you're kind to injured animals and patient with my clumsy attempts at cooking. I know you read poetry and handle pain with grace. I know you've got strength you don't even recognize and courage that brought you through a blizzard that would have killed most people. Luke's thumbs brushed away her tears. That's all I need to know. And if I told you I've been lying to you, about my name, my past, about everything, then I'd say the truth of a person isn't in the facts of their history, it's in the choices they make when no one's watching. And I've watched you choose kindness over selfishness, generosity over greed, courage over comfort. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Clara looked into his eyes and saw something she'd never encountered before: unconditional acceptance. Not acceptance based on what she could provide or what advantage she might bring, but acceptance of her as a person, flaws and secrets and all. I want to tell you the truth, she whispered. When you're ready, not before. What if the truth changes everything? Luke smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. The only thing that could change everything is if you told me you didn't care about this life we've been building together. Everything else we'll figure it out as we go. Clara felt something shift inside her, a recognition that she had found something worth fighting for. This man, this life, this simple cabin in the middle of nowhere, it was more precious than all the gold in her father's mines. I do care, she said softly, more than I ever thought possible. Then that's all that matters. As Luke pulled her into his arms, Clara felt the last of her resistance crumble. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and eventually the truth would have to be told. But tonight, held in the embrace of a man who saw her heart rather than her circumstances, she allowed herself to believe that love might be stronger than fear, that truth might be more powerful than deception, and that sometimes the most precious treasures were found in the most unexpected places. Spring arrived slowly in Wyoming, marked not by sudden warmth but by subtle changes. the quality of light through the windows, the sound of water running beneath the ice, and the restless energy of the horses, sensing the changing season. Luke had been working on a special project in the evenings, his hands carefully shaping a piece of maple wood into something beautiful. Clara discovered what he was making on a morning when she woke early and found him by the fire, putting the finishing touches on a hand-carved wooden comb. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each tooth perfectly smooth, the handle decorated with delicate patterns that spoke of hours of patient work. "It's beautiful," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Luke looked up, a slight flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "Thought you might like something to replace that broken one you've been using." Clara accepted the comb with reverence, running her fingers over the smooth wood. In her previous life, she had owned combs made of silver and ivory, encrusted with precious stones. None had moved her as much as this simple gift, carved by Luke's own hands during the long winter evenings. "I've never received anything more beautiful," she said, and meant it completely. "It's not much." "It's everything," Clara interrupted, looking into his eyes. "It's made with care and given with love. That makes it priceless." Luke's expression grew serious. "Clara, I need to tell you something. These past months, having you here, it's changed everything for me. I know your circumstances are complicated, and I don't want to pressure you, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel." Clara's heart began to race. She had seen this moment coming, had both hoped for and dreaded it in equal measure. "I love you," Luke said simply. "I love your strength and your gentleness. I love the way you hum while you work, and the way you read to me in the evenings. I love how you've made this cabin into a home just by being in it." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. "Luke, let me finish." He stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the slowly awakening landscape. "I know I don't have much to offer. This cabin, this land, it's not fancy. I can't give you silk dresses or servants or trips to Europe, but I can give you a life filled with honest work and simple pleasures. I can give you my whole heart and the promise that I'll spend every day trying to make you happy." Clara rose and went to stand beside him. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Luke turned to face her, his blue eyes intense with emotion. "I'm asking if you'd consider building a life with me. I know your past is complicated, and I'm not asking you to tell me everything right now. But if there's a chance you could love me the way I love you, then I'll wait as long as it takes for you to be ready." Clara felt her world tilting on its axis. Here was everything she had dreamed of, but never believed she could have a man who loved her for herself, who asked nothing of her but her heart. The weight of her deception pressed down on her, but so did the overwhelming desire to say yes, to claim this happiness while she could. "I do love you," she whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." Luke's face lit up with joy. "Then you'll marry me?" "Yes," Clara said, the word rushing out before she could second-guess herself. "Yes, I'll marry you." Luke swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small cabin while she laughed with pure happiness. When he set her down, his hands framed her face with gentle reverence. "I'll make you happy, Clara. I swear it." "You already have," she replied, and kissed him with all the love and hope and desperate gratitude in her heart. They spent the rest of the morning making plans. A simple ceremony. Luke suggested perhaps the circuit preacher who came through in late spring, or a trip to town to see Pastor Williams. Clara agreed to everything, swept up in the joy of the moment and the relief of finally having made her choice. But as the day wore on, the reality of her situation began to press in on her again. She was Clara Beaumont, heir to a mining fortune, promised in marriage to another man. Her engagement to Charles Morrison had been announced in newspapers across the country. Her disappearance had surely caused a scandal that reached from San Francisco to New York. That evening, as Luke worked on plans for expanding the cabin to accommodate a family, Clara sat at the small table with paper and pen, trying to compose a letter she had been putting off for weeks. She had written dozens of versions, each one torn up before completion. How did one explain abandoning everything for love to a world that valued contracts over feelings? "Dear Father," she began for the 15th time, I know my absence has caused you distress, and for that I am truly sorry. But I cannot return to the life you have planned for me. I have found something here that I never knew existed, a love that asks nothing of me but that I be myself." She paused, knowing that her father would never understand. To him, love was a luxury that the wealthy could afford only after securing their practical interests. Marriage was a business arrangement, children were heirs to be trained, and happiness was what you bought with the profits. "I am safe and well," she continued. "I have found a good man who will care for me, as your money and position never could. Please do not look for me. I am where I belong now." She signed it simply Clara and sealed it without an address. She couldn't send it not yet, but writing it helped clarify her own thoughts. She was choosing Luke, choosing this life, but she wasn't naive about the consequences. Her family would never stop looking for her. Charles Morrison would consider her flight a personal insult that demanded retribution. The resources they could bring to bear in hunting her down were virtually limitless. Eventually, they would find her, and when they did, Luke would be in danger simply for having loved her. "You're brooding again," Luke observed, looking up from his sketches. "Just thinking about the future." "Our future?" Clara managed a smile. "Yes, our future." But even as she said it, she wondered how long they would have, how long before her past caught up with them, how long before she would have to choose between Luke's safety and her own happiness. Luke must have seen something in her expression because he set aside his work and came to sit beside her. "Whatever's troubling you, we'll face it together." "You say that now, but you don't know what you're promising." "I know I'm promising to stand by the woman I love, no matter what comes. That's enough for any man." Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I hope you still feel that way when you know everything." "I will," Luke said with quiet certainty. "Love doesn't run when things get difficult, Clara. Real love stays and fights." As they sat together in the lamplight, Clara allowed herself to believe him. Perhaps love could be stronger than fear. Perhaps truth could triumph over deception. Perhaps two people who had found each other against all odds could build something lasting. But even as she hoped, she continued to listen for the sound of approaching horses, continued to check the windows before lighting the lamps, continued to sleep with one hand on the knife Luke had given her. Because while love might conquer all in fairy tales, Clara knew that in the real world, love sometimes had to be fought for, and she was prepared to fight for Luke Callahan with everything she had. The wooden comb lay on the table beside her unfinished letter, a symbol of the simple life she had chosen over the complicated one she had left behind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was simply a woman in love with a good man, planning a wedding and dreaming of a future filled with honest work and simple happiness. If only it could be that simple. The man who rode into Luke's yard 3 weeks later looked like trouble dressed in a long coat and a badge. He was tall and lean, with the cold eyes of someone who had seen too much of the world's darker corners. His horse was fine quality, better than most sheriffs could afford, and his gear spoke of money behind his authority. Clara watched from the window as Luke emerged from the barn, his movements casual but alert. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his wariness, the slight shift in his stance, the way his hand drifted near his gun without seeming to, the measured pace of his approach. "Afternoon," the stranger called out. "You Luke Callahan?" "I am. What can I do for you?" The man dismounted with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the property with professional thoroughness. "Name's Garrett Stone. I'm a licensed investigator, working a missing person case. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Clara's blood ran cold. This wasn't the local sheriff asking routine questions. This was a professional manhunter, and she had no doubt who had hired him. "Depends on the questions," Luke replied evenly. Stone reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper-wanted poster or photograph. Clara couldn't tell from her vantage point. "Looking for a young woman, about 25, dark hair, green eyes. Goes by the name Clara Beaumont. Her family's mighty worried about her. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." Stone's smile was thin and predatory. That's interesting, because I've been tracking her movements pretty carefully. Trail leads right through this area. Lot of people pass through during traveling season. This woman's different. See, she's worth a considerable sum to the right people. Her family's offering $50,000 for information leading to her safe return. Clara saw Luke's shoulders tense slightly. $50,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to buy a dozen ranches like Luke's, enough to secure a future beyond anyone's dreams. That's a lot of money, Luke said carefully. It is indeed. The kind of money that could change a man's whole life. Buy him things he never dreamed of having. Stone stepped closer to Luke, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. Of course, there are other people looking for Miss Beaumont too. People who might not be quite so generous with their rewards. People who might take it personal if someone was helping her stay hidden. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Clara felt her hands trembling as she gripped the window frame. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to arrive with such calculated menace. Sounds like this woman has complicated problems, Luke observed. Oh, she does. Ran out on an engagement to a very important man. Left her family in quite a bind. Morrison, that's her intended. He's got business interests that depend on this marriage going through. Political connections too. The kind of man who doesn't like being embarrassed. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her old life closing in around her. Charles Morrison was exactly the kind of man who would hire investigators, who would use threats and intimidation to get what he wanted. She had hoped distance and time would weaken his pursuit, but clearly she had underestimated his determination. What makes you think she came through here? Luke asked. Stone pulled out a crumpled wanted poster, showing it to Luke. Clara couldn't see the image clearly, but she knew it was probably the formal engagement photograph that had been published in newspapers across the country herself, in an elaborate gown, standing beside Charles Morrison with the smile she had perfected for public appearances. Pretty thing, isn't she? But looks can be deceiving. This woman's caused a lot of trouble for a lot of important people, the kind of trouble that needs to be cleaned up quickly and quietly. I sympathize with her family's concern, Luke said, but I can't help you. Haven't seen her. Stone studied Luke's face with the intensity of a man trained to spot deception. You know, Mr. Callahan, I've been doing this work for a long time. I can usually tell when someone's being straight with me. Then you know I am. Maybe. Or maybe you're just good at lying. Stone remounted his horse, but his eyes never left Luke's face. Thing is, I'm not the only one looking for Miss Beaumont. Word is, Morrison's sent some of his own people west. They're not investigators, Mr. Callahan. They're the kind of men who solve problems with violence. Are you threatening me? Just sharing information. See, if I find Miss Beaumont first, she goes back to her family safe and sound. If Morrison's men find her first, well, let's just say her running days would be over permanently, and anyone who helped her might find themselves with similar problems. Luke's hand moved closer to his gun. I think you've said enough. Stone smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I think you're right, but I'll be back through this way in a few days. If your memory improves, there's good money in it for you. If it doesn't, well, Morrison's men are only about a week behind me. With that, he spurred his horse and rode away, leaving Luke standing in the yard with a troubled expression. Clara waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before rushing outside. Luke, I know, he said quietly. We heard enough from inside. You should have taken the money. Luke turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. Is that what you think of me? I think you're in danger because of me. $50,000, Luke, that's more than you could make in 10 lifetimes. Money doesn't mean much if you sell your soul to get it. Clara felt tears burning her eyes. Those men he mentioned, Morrison's men, they're not making idle threats. Charles Morrison is ruthless, and he has the resources to make good on his promises. Then we'll deal with them when they come. We? Luke, you don't understand what you're up against. These aren't cowboys or drifters, they're professional killers. Luke stepped closer to her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Clara, are you Clara Beaumont? The direct question hung in the air between them. Clara looked into his eyes and saw that he already knew the answer, had probably suspected for weeks. The time for deception was over. "Yes," she whispered. "Are you running from a forced marriage?" "Yes." "Do you love me?" "With all my heart." Luke nodded slowly. "Then that's all I need to know. The rest, the money, the threats, the important pio planon of that matters. What matters is that you chose to be here with me, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you away. But the danger, I've faced danger before. The question is, what do you want to do? Do you want to run again, keep looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life? Or do you want to make a stand here, together?" Clara thought about the life she had fled, the golden cage of wealth and social expectations, the loveless marriage to a man who saw her as property, the endless succession of empty days filled with meaningless activities. Then she thought about the life she had found, here, honest work, genuine affection, the simple pleasure of building something real with someone who loved her. "I want to stay," she said firmly. "I want to fight for this life we've built." "Then we will. But Clarano, more secrets between us. If we're going to face this together, I need to know everything." Clara nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Everything. I promise." As they walked back toward the cabin, Clara felt a mixture of fear and relief. The truth was finally out, and while that brought new dangers, it also brought the possibility of facing those dangers with complete honesty between them. Whatever came next, they would meet it together, and that made all the difference. But as she glanced back at the horizon where Stone had disappeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. Morrison's men were coming, and when they arrived, the peaceful life she and Luke had built would be put to the ultimate test. That evening, by the light of the oil lamp, Clara told Luke everything. She began with her childhood in San Francisco, growing up as the only daughter of mining magnate Jonathan Beaumont. She described the weight of expectations, the carefully orchestrated social events, the business lessons disguised as dinner conversations. She spoke of her father's empire mines stretching from California to Colorado, investments in railroads and shipping, a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest unmarried women in America. Luke listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face as she painted a picture of a life so far removed from his own experience that it might have been fiction. Yet he could see the truth of it in her manner, the way certain memories made her shoulders tense, the practiced grace that spoke of years of formal training. "The engagement to Charles Morrison was arranged when I was 21, Clara continued, her voice growing strained. "Father presented it as a business merger, disguised as a marriage. Morrison's shipping interests complemented our mining operations. Together, they said, we would control commerce from the Pacific to the Atlantic." "What was he like?" Luke asked quietly. Clara shuddered slightly. "Cold, calculating. He looked at me the way other men might look at a prize horse, evaluating my breeding, my potential for producing heirs. During our courtship, if you could call it that, he made it clear that marriage would not change his habits. He had mistresses, gambling debts, a reputation for violence toward anyone who crossed him." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small pouch, spilling its contents onto the table. Gold coins caught the lamplight. More money than Luke had ever seen in one place. "This is what I took when I left," Clara said, her voice hollow. "A fraction of what was mine by right, but enough to start over somewhere else. I thought if I could disappear completely, they would eventually give up looking for me." Luke picked up one of the coins, feeling its weight. "Your family, they must love you. Surely they wouldn't force you into a marriage that makes you unhappy." Clara's laugh was bitter. "Love, in my family, is measured in stock portfolios and political influence. My happiness was never part of the equation. When I tried to refuse the engagement, my father made it clear that defying him would mean losing everything, not just my inheritance, but my family, my home, my very identity." "So, you ran?" "I ran. The night before the formal engagement announcement, I slipped away during a dinner party. I had planned to go to Denver, maybe catch a train east, where Morrison's influence was weaker. But the storm, my horse-throwing mate, led me here." Luke set down the coin and reached for her hands. Do you regret it? Running away? Never. But I regret the danger I've brought to you. You deserve better than to be caught up in my problems. Clara, look at me. Luke's voice was gentle but firm. You think I care about your money or your family's power? You think that changes how I feel about you? Doesn't it? I'm not just Clara Mason, the runaway governess. I'm Clara Beaumont, and that comes with complications you never signed up for. Luke stood and walked to the mantelpiece, picking up the horseshoe that had been there since the day he found her. You know what I see when I look at this? I see the moment my life changed for the better. I don't care if you're the richest woman in the West or the poorest. What I care about is the woman who helped me fix that broken fence post, who stayed up all night tending to the sick colt, who makes this cabin feel like home just by being in it. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks. But the threats, the danger stone, wasn't exaggerating. Morrison has killed people who got in his way. Then we'll have to make sure we're ready for whatever comes. How can you be so calm about this? Luke returned to sit beside her, his expression thoughtful. You want to know why I really came to Wyoming? Why I left everything behind to build this life out here? Clara nodded, sensing that he was about to share something he'd never told anyone. My real name is Lucas Callahan Morrison. Charles Morrison is my cousin. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. What? My grandfather built a shipping empire in Boston. When he died, it was supposed to be split between his two sons, my father, and Charles's father. But Charles's father was older, more ruthless. He squeezed my father out, destroyed his reputation, took everything. My father died broken and bitter, and I watched my mother waste away from the shame of it all. Clara stared at him in shock. You're related to Charles? Unfortunately, yes. I grew up knowing exactly what kind of man he is. When I turned 18, I took my mother's maiden name and came west to get as far away from that world as possible. I wanted to build something honest, something that couldn't be taken away by lawyers and corrupt politicians. Does Charles know where you are? He knows I exist, but he probably thinks I'm dead or lost to drink somewhere. Men like Charles don't waste time keeping track of poor relations. Luke's expression hardened. But now that I know he's the one hunting you, this has become personal. Clara felt a new fear settling over her. Luke, you can't let him know who you are. If he realizes you're his cousin, he'll what? Try to intimidate me with the family name, threaten to cut me off from money I never wanted? Luke's smile was grim. Clara, Charles Morrison destroyed my family once. I'll be damned if I let him destroy the new family I'm trying to build. This isn't just about intimidation. Stone was right. Morrison will send killers. Then we'll be ready for them. Luke stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a rifle Clara hadn't seen before. It was well maintained, the stock showing the wear of frequent use. I wasn't always a simple rancher, Clara. During the range wars, I rode with men who knew how to fight. I know how to defend what's mine. Clara watched him check the rifle's action with practiced ease, seeing a side of Luke she'd never glimpsed before. The gentleman who carved wooden combs and read Shakespeare by firelight was also someone who could face down armed killers without flinching. What do we do now? She asked. Now we prepare. We get word to the neighbors, the ones we can trust. We make sure our defenses are solid. And we wait. And if Morrison's men come? Luke's eyes met hers, and she saw steel beneath the gentleness. Then they'll learn that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. Clara felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She had spent her life running from conflicts, letting others make her decisions for her. But here, with Luke, she felt the possibility of standing and fighting for something worth having. I have money, she said suddenly, enough to hire protection, to fight Morrison with his own weapons. No, Luke's voice was firm. The moment we start using your money, we become part of the world you ran away from. We do this with what we have, who we are, or we don't do it at all. Clara nodded, understanding. This wasn't about wealth or power, it was about the right to choose their own lives, to love whom they chose without interference from those who saw people as property to be traded. "Then we make our stand here," she said. "Together," Luke agreed. As they began to plan their defense, Clara felt a calm determination settling over her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from a fight. She was preparing to stand and face it, with a man who loved her enough to risk everything for their future together. The golden coins lay scattered on the table between them, but neither paid them any attention. They had found something more valuable than all the wealth in the world. They had found each other, and they would not let anyone take that away. The official documents arrived 3 days later, delivered by a nervous clerk from the territorial courthouse, who clearly wanted to complete his business and leave as quickly as possible. Luke signed for the papers with a steady hand, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders as he unfolded the legal documents. "What is it?" Clara asked, though the formal seals and heavy paper told her this was serious business. Luke's face had gone pale as he read. "It's a court order. Morrison's claiming you're mentally incompetent, that you were kidnapped and are being held against your will. He's petitioned the territorial court to have you declared a ward of the state and returned to your family's custody." Clara snatched the papers from his hands, her eyes scanning the legal language with growing horror. Charles Morrison had sworn before a judge that she was suffering from hysteria, that she had been manipulated by unscrupulous individuals who were holding her for ransom. Her own father had signed an affidavit supporting the claim, describing her as mentally fragile and easily influenced. "This is monstrous," Clara breathed. "They're trying to have me declared insane." "There's more." Luke's voice was grim as he pointed to another section of the documents. "They've also filed a warrant for my arrest. Kidnapping, extortion, unlawful imprisonment. If they can prove I'm holding you against your will, I'll hang." Clara felt the room spinning around her. They can do this. They can simply declare me incompetent and drag me back? Unfortunately, yes. Women have very few legal rights when it comes to family disputes. If your father and your fiancé both swear you're not in your right mind, most judges will side with them. The implications crashed down on Clara like an avalanche. Not only were they trying to force her back into the marriage, they were doing it in a way that would discredit everything she said. If she was declared mentally incompetent, her testimony about Morrison's character, about her own wishes and desires, would be worthless in any court. "There's something else," Luke said quietly, pulling out another document that had been folded separately. "This one's addressed to me personally." Clara watched his face change as he read, seeing surprise, then anger, then something that looked almost like resignation. "What does it say?" Luke handed her the letter without a word. The paper was expensive, the letterhead bearing the Morrison family crest. Clara's hands trembled as she read. "Lucas, yes, I know who you are. Did you really think you could hide from family forever? Your little masquerade as a simple rancher is quite touching, but it ends now. You have something that belongs to me, and I want it back. Miss Beaumont's recent emotional disturbance has made her vulnerable to exploitation, and I'm afraid your resentment toward our family has clouded your judgment. Return her immediately, and I'll consider letting you disappear back into obscurity. Refuse, and I'll ensure that everyone knows exactly who you are and what kind of blood runs in your veins. The good people of Wyoming might be interested to learn that the man they trust as a neighbor is actually a Morrison, with all that implies. I'm sure they'd be even more interested to know about your activities during the Copper Mountain incident. Some secrets are better left buried, don't you think? You have 3 days to deliver Miss Beaumont to the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne. Don't make me come collect her myself. Your loving cousin, Charles." Clara's blood ran cold. "What's the Copper Mountain incident?" Luke's jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists. "Something that happened 5 years ago. A range war between the big cattle barons and the smaller ranchers. I was involved in resolving the conflict." "What kind of resolution?" Luke was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the peaceful landscape. 3 men died, Clara, men who were burning out homesteaders, terrorizing families. I was part of the group that stopped them. That sounds like you were protecting people. We were, but we weren't wearing badges, and we didn't wait for a trial. Charles is right. If the authorities chose to look into it, they could probably find enough evidence to hang me for murder. Clara felt the trap closing around them. Morrison hadn't just found them. He had discovered Luke's true identity and armed himself with enough leverage to destroy them both. If Luke refused to hand her over, Morrison could expose him as both a member of the hated Morrison family and a vigilante killer. If he complied, Clara would be dragged back to a life of captivity and forced marriage. He's thought of everything, Clara said bitterly. Not everything. Luke's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. He's made one critical mistake. What's that? He thinks I'm still the broken young man who ran away from Boston 20 years ago. He doesn't understand what I've become out here, what I'm willing to do to protect what's mine. Clara looked at Luke with new eyes, seeing past the gentle rancher to the man who had survived range wars and built a life with his own hands. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Charles Morrison has been playing games in boardrooms and courthouses for so long. He's forgotten that some fights are settled with more than lawyers and bribes. Luke, you can't be thinking of... I'm thinking of ending this once and for all. Morrison wants a fight. I'll give him one, but it'll be on my terms, in my territory, with my rules. Clara grabbed his arm. That's exactly what he wants. He's baiting you into doing something that will justify everything he's accused you of. Maybe. Or maybe it's time someone stood up to him in a language he understands. And then what? Even if you win, even if you somehow defeat Morrison and his men, we'll still be outlaws. We'll have to spend the rest of our lives running. Luke turned to face her, his blue eyes intense. Clara, what do you think our life would be like if we run now? How long before Morrison tracks us down again? How long before the next bounty hunter shows up? Or the next set of legal papers? He'll never stop hunting you, and he'll never stop using me as leverage against you. Clara knew he was right. Men like Morrison didn't accept defeat. They escalated until they got what they wanted, or destroyed everyone who opposed them. But there might be another way, she said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. What do you mean? Clara walked to the table where the gold coins still lay scattered. What if we don't fight Morrison directly? What if we fight him with his own weapons? You're talking about using your money. I'm talking about using my legal rights. Morrison's entire case depends on proving I'm mentally incompetent. But what if I voluntarily appeared before a judge not as a victim, but as a competent woman making her own choices? Luke frowned. The courts are probably already in Morrison's pocket. Maybe the territorial courts, but what about federal court? What if I formally renounced my inheritance, signed over all my rights to the Beaumont fortune to charity? If I have no money, no property, no holdings, what leverage does Morrison have left? Your father would disown you. He already has, in everything but name. Clara's voice grew stronger as the plan took shape in her mind. Luke, don't you see? The only reason Morrison wants to marry me is for access to the Beaumont mining empire. If that's gone, if I'm legally just another penniless woman who's chosen her own husband, what can he do? He could still come after us out of spite. Could he? Charles Morrison is a businessman above all else. He doesn't waste resources on ventures that don't profit him. If marrying me gains him nothing, he'll find another way to achieve his goals. Luke considered this, his strategic mind working through the implications. It would mean giving up everything, your entire inheritance, any claim to your family's wealth. Once that's done, there's no going back. I don't want to go back, Clara said firmly. I want to go forward, with you, as whoever we choose to be. Let Morrison have his boardrooms and his corrupt judges. Let my father have his mines and his money. All I want is the right to choose my own life. Luke looked at her with something approaching awe. You'd really do that? Give up one of the largest fortunes in America for this life? Clara picked up the simple wooden comb Luke had made for her, feeling its smooth surface beneath her fingers. This comb is worth more to me than all the gold in California. You made it with your own hands. gave it with love. That's the only kind of wealth I want. For the first time since the documents had arrived, Luke smiled. All right then, if you're sure about this, let's go to Cheyenne and give Charles Morrison the surprise of his life. Together? Together. But Clarence, we do this, we're committed. There's no backing down. Clara looked around the simple cabin that had become her home, at the man who had become her heart, at the life they had built together from nothing but love and hard work. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, but inside the cabin, Clara felt a calm she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since leaving San Francisco, she wasn't running from her problems, she was preparing to face them head-on, with the man she loved beside her and a plan that could free them both from the shadows of their past. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days, and Luke spent every mile planning for what was to come. He rode with his father's old rifle across his saddle, the weapon that had seen him through the range wars and more than one desperate fight. The rifle was more than just a tool, it was a reminder of the man he had been forced to become and the choices that had shaped his character. Clara rode beside him on the gentle mare he'd given her, her posture straight and determined despite the gravity of what they were about to attempt. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing the finest dress she had brought with her, simple blue wool that nonetheless spoke of quality and refinement. She wanted to look competent and rational when she faced the judge, not like the hysterical woman Morrison's papers described. "Tell me about the federal judge," Clara said, as they crested a hill that gave them their first view of Cheyenne in the distance. "Judge Harrison. He's fair, from what I hear. Been on the federal bench for 10 years, appointed by President Cleveland. He's got a reputation for following the law rather than political pressure." Luke adjusted his rifle's position, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Morrison's men. "But Clara, even if he's completely honest, what we're proposing is unprecedented. A woman voluntarily renouncing her inheritance to escape an unwanted marriage. The legal precedents just don't exist." "Then we'll make new precedents." Luke smiled at her determination, but his expression grew serious as they approached the outskirts of town. "There's something else you need to know. Morrison will have people watching the courthouse, watching the hotel, probably watching every road into town. The moment we show ourselves, we'll be walking into his territory. Are you having second thoughts?" "No, but I want to make sure you understand what we're facing. Morrison doesn't just have money and lawyers, he has men who are willing to use violence to get what he wants. If this goes badly, we might not get a chance to leave town alive." Clara was quiet for a moment, considering this. "What would you do if I weren't here? If it was just you facing Morrison?" "I'd probably put a bullet in him and be done with it." The matter-of-fact way he said it sent a chill down Clara's spine. She was seeing more of the man Luke had been during the range wars, the side of him that had learned to survive in a world where law and order were often decided by who could shoot fastest and straightest. "But that's not an option now," Luke continued, "because you deserve better than a life spent running from the law, and I won't make you into an outlaw's woman. What if the legal approach doesn't work?" Luke's hand moved to rest on his rifle stock. "Then we'll try it my way." They reached Cheyenne as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Clara of the sunsets she had watched from Luke's cabin. The town was larger than she had expected, with actual streets and sidewalks, gas lamps beginning to flicker to life, and the bustle of commerce that spoke of civilization reaching even into the wilderness. "Morrison's here," Luke said quietly, nodding toward the Grand Hotel where several well-dressed men stood on the porch, their attention focused on the street. "How can you tell? Those aren't local men. Look at their clothes, their horses, and see how they're positioned. They've got eyes on every approach to the hotel and the courthouse." Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. After months of hiding, she was about to come face to face with the man she had fled from, the man who had tried to buy her like a piece of property. "Where do we go?" she asked. "Federal courthouse is on the north side of town. We'll stable the horses at Murphy. She's an old friend who fought beside me during the Copper Mountain incident." Then we find a place to stay for the night that's not being watched." They made their way through the streets carefully, Luke's experienced eye noting the positions of Morrison's watchers, the escape routes, the places where trouble might come from. Clara marveled at his transformation from gentle rancher to tactical strategist, understanding for the first time the depth of experience that lay beneath his quiet exterior. Murphy's stable was a ramshackle affair, run by a grizzled Irishman who greeted Luke with genuine warmth and obvious respect. "Luke Callahan, you old devil, what brings you to town?" "Trouble, Murphy. The kind that might follow me here." Murphy's expression grew serious. "The Morrison kind of trouble? You know about that. Word travels fast in a town this size. Charles Morrison's been here 3 days, throwing money around, asking questions. Also been making threats about what happens to anyone who helps his poor, deranged cousin's bride." Murphy glanced at Clara with shrewd eyes. "This would be the lady in question, I'm guessing. Clara Beaumont. Meet Sean Murphy. Sean, Miss Beaumont." Murphy touched his hat respectfully. "Pleasure, miss, and might I say, you've got excellent taste in men. Luke's one of the finest men I've ever known." "Thank you, Mr. Murphy. I quite agree. Sean, we need a place to stay tonight that Morrison's people won't be watching." Murphy rubbed his stubbled chin thoughtfully. "My sister runs a boarding house on the east side of town. Clean, quiet, and she doesn't ask questions. I'll send word you're coming." "What about Morrison's legal papers?" "Federal judge is hearing the case tomorrow at 10. Town's been buzzing about Richest woman in the West, being held captive by a dangerous outlaw. Morrison's been very generous with his version of events." Luke's jaw tightened. "What's the general sentiment?" "Mixed. Some folks believe Morrison's story, especially after he spread around some money and told tales about your violent past. But others remember how you handled yourself during the range wars, how you stood up for the little ranchers against the cattle barons. They're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt." "And Judge Harrison?" "He's staying neutral, as judges should, but I heard he's been asking some pointed questions about Morrison's evidence. Apparently, declaring a competent woman insane requires more proof than Morrison thought it would." Clara felt a spark of hope. Perhaps their plan had a chance after all. They spent the evening at Murphy's sister's boarding house, a comfortable establishment run by a no-nonsense Irish woman named Bridget, who took one look at Clara and declared her far too sensible to be suffering from hysteria. The simple endorsement meant more to Clara than any character reference from high society ever had. Luke spent the time cleaning his rifle and checking his ammunition, preparing for the possibility that legal remedies might prove insufficient. Clara watched him work, seeing the careful attention he paid to each detail, the practiced efficiency that spoke of long experience with violence. "Are you afraid?" she asked as he reassembled the weapon. "Terrified," Luke admitted. "Not of Morrison or his men. I've faced worse odds than that. But afraid of losing you, afraid of failing to protect what we've built together." "I'm afraid too, but I'm also excited." Luke looked up from his rifle with surprise. "Excited? For the first time in my life, I'm not letting other people make my decisions for me. Win or lose, I'm finally taking control of my own destiny." Clara moved to sit beside him on the narrow bed. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. Don't talk like this is goodbye." "I'm not. I'm talking like this is the beginning of our real life together. Tomorrow, we're going to walk into that courthouse and tell the world that Clara Beaumont chooses love over money, Luke Callahan over Charles Morrison, freedom over security." Luke set aside the rifle and took her hands in his. "And if the judge doesn't listen, if Morrison's influence proves too strong, then we'll know we tried to do things the right way, and if that fails," Clara's eyes hardened with determination, "then we'll do things your way." Luke studied her face, seeing a strength there that had been forged in the crucible of their shared trials. This wasn't the sheltered heiress who had collapsed in his yard months ago. This was a woman who had chosen her path and was prepared to fight for it. "All right then," he said, "tomorrow we make our stand." They spent their last night before the confrontation, holding each other close, drawing strength from their shared resolve. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the town settling into sleep, but Clara knew that Morrison's men were still out there, watching and waiting. In a few hours, she would walk into a federal courthouse and renounce the largest personal fortune in the American West. She would declare her love for a man most of her former peers would consider beneath her station. She would bet everything on the hope that justice and truth could triumph over money and influence. It was the biggest gamble of her life, but as she fell asleep in Luke's arms, Clara felt certain she was betting on the right things. Love was worth more than gold, freedom was worth more than security, and the chance to choose her own destiny was worth any risk. Tomorrow would determine whether the rest of the world agreed with her assessment. But regardless of the outcome, Clara Beaumont had already won the only prize that truly mattered. She had found a man who loved her for herself, not for what she could bring him, and she was prepared to fight the whole world to keep him. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was an imposing stone building that spoke of permanence and authority. Clara stood on its steps at 5 minutes before 10, her hand resting on Luke's arm, watching the crowd that had gathered to witness what the local newspaper had dubbed the trial of the century. Word had spread quickly about the richest woman in the West, appearing to contest her own competency. Hearing, and it seemed half the territory had turned out to watch. Charles Morrison stood near the courthouse entrance, surrounded by a phalanx of lawyers and well-dressed associates. At 38, he was still handsome in the way that money and power could make a man attractive tall, impeccably groomed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. When his eyes found Clara across the crowd, his smile was cold and predatory. "Miss Beaumont," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. "How wonderful to see you looking so improved. Your ordeal must have been terrible." Clara felt Luke tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. "Mr. Morrison, I see you've brought quite an entourage with you." "Just concerned parties, my dear. People who care about your welfare and want to see you safely return to your family." Morrison's gaze shifted to Luke, and his expression hardened. "Cousin Lucas, it's been far too long." "Not nearly long enough, Charles." Now, is that any way to greet family, especially family you've wronged so grievously?" Luke's hand moved closer to his gun, but Clara's grip on his arm tightened. This was exactly what Morrison wanted, to provoke Luke into violence that would justify everything he'd claimed in his legal papers. "Gentlemen," Clara said firmly, "perhaps we should save our discussions for the courtroom." Morrison's laugh was light and condescending. "Of course, my dear, though I do hope you've come to your senses. This, whatever this has been, it doesn't have to end badly for anyone. You could simply come home with me now, and we could put this unfortunate episode behind us." "I am home," Clara replied, "with the man I've chosen to marry." "Ah, yes, your choice." Morrison's tone made the word sound ridiculous. "Clara, darling, you've been through a terrible trauma. You're not thinking clearly. But that's what families are for, to protect us from our own poor judgment when we're not well." Clara felt something shift inside her, a cold anger that crystallized into perfect clarity. She reached into her reticule and pulled out the expensive engagement ring Morrison had given her. Months ago, a massive diamond, surrounded by emeralds that had cost more than most people's homes. Without hesitation, she dropped it on the courthouse steps. "I am Clara Beaumont," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I am 25 years old, sound of mind and body, and I renounce any claim you think you have over my life or my person." Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "Clara, you're making a scene." "Good. Let everyone hear this. I was never kidnapped, never held against my will, never suffered from any mental disturbance. I ran away from an engagement I never wanted to, a man I could never love, and I found something better." The crowd was listening intently now, drawn into the drama unfolding before them. Clara could see reporters scribbling notes, townspeople whispering among themselves, Morrison's associates looking uncomfortable with this very public confrontation. "What you found," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone, "was a man willing to exploit your temporary confusion for his own gain. Lucas has been filling your head with romantic nonsense while planning to extort money from your family. The only person who has ever tried to exploit me is you." Clara shot back. "You saw me as a business opportunity, a way to merge your shipping interests with my father's mining empire. You never cared about me as a person. I cared enough to offer you the security of marriage, the protection of my name. You offered me a cage lined with gold. Mr. Callahan offered me freedom." Morrison's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold fury beneath. "Freedom? You call living in squalor with a violent outlaw freedom? Do you know what your precious Luke did during the Copper Mountain incident? He murdered 3 men in cold blood. I know he protected innocent families from men who were terrorizing them." Clara replied, "I know he's never raised his hand to me, never threatened me, never tried to force me into anything against my will. Can you say the same?" The crowd stirred at this exchange, sensing the deeper currents of conflict. Morrison realized he was losing control of the narrative, and his expression grew dangerous. "This is pointless," he said. "The court will determine your competency, and when it does, you'll be remanded to my custody as your legal guardian and intended husband." "Actually," came a new voice from the courthouse steps, "the court is ready to hear from Miss Beaumont herself." Judge Harrison stood in the doorway, a distinguished man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "If the parties are ready, we'll convene the hearing. Miss Beaumont, I'm particularly interested in hearing your testimony." Clara felt Luke squeeze her hand reassuringly. This was the moment that would determine the rest of their lives. "I'm ready, Your Honor," she said clearly. As they filed into the courthouse, Clara caught Morrison's eye one last time. His expression promised that if the legal route failed, he had other methods at his disposal. But Clara was no longer the frightened woman who had fled San Francisco in the night. She was ready to fight for her freedom, and she had Luke Callahan beside her. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Judge Harrison called for order as Clara took her place at the witness stand, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "Miss Beaumont," Judge Harrison began, "you stand accused by your father and intended husband of being mentally incompetent and in need of guardianship. How do you respond to these charges?" Clara looked out at the crowd, seeing Morrison's confident sneer, her father's stern disapproval, and Luke's encouraging nod. "Your Honor, I am completely competent to make my own decisions. I fled San Francisco of my own free will to escape an engagement I never consented to. I have been living freely with Mr. Callahan, planning to marry him by choice. The petitioners claim you've been coerced, that your judgment has been compromised by your ordeal. My judgment has never been clearer. For the first time in my life, I'm making decisions based on love rather than duty, on personal happiness rather than business advantage." Morrison's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Blackwood, rose to object. "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of romantic delusion we would expect from someone suffering from hysteria. Miss Beaumont has abandoned a life of comfort and refinement for a life of honest work and genuine affection." Clara interrupted. "I've learned skills I never knew I possessed, found strength I never knew I had, and discovered what it means to be valued for myself rather than my inheritance." Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. "Tell me about this inheritance, Miss Beaumont." This was the moment Clara had been preparing for. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick legal document she and Luke had prepared the night before. "Your Honor, I hereby formally renounce all claim to the Beaumont family fortune. I am donating my entire inheritance to establish schools and hospitals throughout the Western Territories." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Morrison shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "She can't do that. She's clearly not competent to make such a decision." "On the contrary," Judge Harrison said, examining the document, This appears to be exactly the kind of reasoned, altruistic decision that demonstrates sound judgment. Miss Beaumont, you understand that this action is irrevocable? I do, Your Honor, and I make it freely, in full possession of my mental faculties. But why? Morrison demanded. Why throw away everything for a life of poverty? Clara turned to face him directly. Because I've learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy. I was rich in San Francisco, had money, servants, fine clothes. But I was poor in everything that mattered. Here, with Luke, I have wealth, love, respect, partnership, the satisfaction of work well done. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the simple iron rings Luke had forged for them the night before, wedding bands made from the horseshoe he'd found the day they met. Mr. Morrison, you offered me a diamond engagement ring worth $20,000. Mr. Callahan offered me a ring he made with his own hands from the horseshoe that brought us together. Which do you think means more to a woman who wants to be loved rather than owned? The symbolism wasn't lost on the crowd. Clara could see approval in many faces, understanding in the eyes of women who had faced their own pressures to marry for advantage rather than affection. Judge Harrison studied the iron rings with obvious interest. These represent your choice, Miss Beaumont. They represent our choice, Your Honor. Luke and I have chosen each other freely, knowing exactly what we're accepting and what we're giving up. Morrison's attorney made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, even if we accept Miss Beaumont's claim of competency, she cannot simply ignore her legal obligations. She was formally engaged to Mr. Morrison with her father's blessing. An engagement I never agreed to, Clara said firmly. I was told it was a business arrangement that would benefit both families. My personal feelings were never considered. Marriage has always been about more than personal feelings, Morrison interjected. It's about family, duty, responsibility. It's about love, Clara replied. At least it should be, and I love Luke Callahan, not you. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. The court has heard enough testimony to make a determination. Miss Beaumont has demonstrated clear competency in her speech, her reasoning, and her actions. Her decision to renounce her inheritance, while unusual, shows careful consideration of her values and priorities. He paused, looking around the packed courtroom. Furthermore, the court finds no evidence of coercion or kidnapping. Miss Beaumont clearly chose her current circumstances and continues to choose them with full knowledge of the alternatives. Morrison was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is a miscarriage of justice. Mr. Morrison, Judge Harrison said sternly, the court finds that Miss Beaumont is competent to make her own decisions regarding marriage and financial matters. Your petition for guardianship is denied. The courtroom exploded in cheers and arguments. Clara felt Luke's strong hand take hers as they stood together, united in their victory. But Morrison wasn't finished. This isn't over, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the noise. A woman doesn't humiliate Charles Morrison and walk away unscathed. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Mr. Morrison, that sounded remarkably like a threat made in a federal courtroom. It was a promise, Your Honor, made as a private citizen to another private citizen. Luke stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. Charles, you've had your day in court. Clara's made her choice. Time to accept it and move on. Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. Oh, I'll move on, cousin. But not until I've collected what's owed me. As they filed out of the courthouse, Clara held tight to Luke's hand and the iron wedding band he'd made for her. They had won the legal battle, but she knew the real fight was just beginning. 1 year later, Clara Callahan sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, her hands working steadily on a quilt made from simple cotton and wool fabrics that had cost pennies compared to the silks and satins of her former life, but which felt infinitely more precious because she had chosen them herself, sewn them with her own hands, and filled them with love for the home she and Luke had built together. The cabin bore little resemblance to the simple structure where Luke had nursed her back to health the previous winter. They had added 2 rooms, a proper kitchen, and a covered porch that looked out over the valley Luke had claimed as their own. The improvements had been paid for, not with Beaumont gold, But with the profits from Luke's growing horse-breeding operation and Clara's surprising talent for preserving and selling the wild berry preserves that grew abundant in the Wyoming hills. "Mrs. Callahan," Luke called from the barn, where he was working with a spirited young colt. "You've got visitors coming up the road." Clara set aside her quilting and shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun. Two riders were approaching, a man and woman she recognized as their neighbors from the next valley over, Tom and Sarah Mitchell. The Mitchells had become good friends over the past year, part of the small but growing community of homesteaders who had chosen to build their lives in this remote corner of Wyoming. "Clara," Sarah called out as they rode into the yard, "have you heard the news from town?" "What news?" Clara asked, though she had a feeling she already knew. Tom Mitchell dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. "Charles Morrison's dead, shot and killed 3 days ago in a duel with a riverboat gambler in New Orleans." Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and something that might have been pity. What happened? From what the newspapers say, he'd been drinking heavily, gambling away what was left of his shipping empire. Apparently he accused this gambler of cheating, challenged him to a duel and lost. Sarah's expression was somber. "They say he'd been in decline ever since that business with you last year." Clara nodded thoughtfully. After the courtroom confrontation, Morrison had made several attempts to cause trouble for them, hiring men to harass their neighbors, spreading rumors about Luke's past, even trying to have him arrested on trumped-up charges. But each effort had failed, partly because Judge Harrison had made it clear that Morrison was under federal scrutiny, and partly because the local community had rallied around Luke and Clara. The final blow to Morrison's credibility had come when several newspapers picked up the story of Clara's voluntary renunciation of her inheritance. The tale of the richest woman in the West, choosing love over money, had captured the public imagination, making Clara a romantic heroine and painting Morrison as the villain who had tried to force an unwanted marriage. "Poor man," Clara said, and meant it. "He never understood that some things can't be bought or forced." Luke emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Tom, Sarah, good to see you." "We thought you should know about Morrison," Tom said, "though I reckon it doesn't change much for you folks." "No," Luke agreed. "That chapter of our lives was already closed." Clara smiled at her husband's practical wisdom. Luke had never been one to dwell on past troubles, preferring to focus on building something positive rather than fighting old battles. It was one of the many things she loved about him. "There's other news too," Sarah said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "The territorial governor is planning to visit our area next month. Word is, he wants to meet the famous Clara Callahan woman who gave away a fortune for love." Clara laughed. "I hope you told him I'm just a homesteader's wife who makes excellent berry preserves." "That's exactly what I told him, but he's still planning to come." After the Mitchells left, Clara and Luke sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. It had become their favorite time of dire, quiet moment to reflect on their blessings and plan for the future. "Any regrets?" Luke asked, a question he posed occasionally, but which had become more ritual than genuine concern. "Only that I waited so long to find you," Clara replied, giving the answer that had become equally ritualistic, but no less true. Luke reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing the simple iron wedding band she wore. "What do you think you'll tell the governor when he comes?" Clara considered this seriously. "I think I'll tell him that wealth isn't measured in gold or silver, but in the quality of the relationships we build and the satisfaction we find in honest work. I'll tell him that freedom isn't the right to do whatever we want, but the ability to choose what we value most." "And what do you value most?" Clara looked around at their modest homestead, the cabin they had built together, the garden where she grew vegetables with her own hands, the horses that Luke trained with patience and skill, the quilts she made from simple materials but infinite care. Then she looked at Luke himself, the man who had given her not just love, but the chance to discover who she really was beneath the layers of wealth and expectation. "This," she said simply, "all of this." but mostly the knowledge that I chose it freely, that it's ours because we built it together, not because we inherited it or bought it or took it from someone else. As if to underscore her point, a movement in the cabin's doorway caught their attention. Dr. Henderson, the traveling physician who served their remote area, had confirmed what Clara had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting their first child. Luke's hand moved to rest gently on her still, flat stomach, his expression filled with wonder and protectiveness. "Our son or daughter will never know what it's like to be valued for anything other than who they are," he said quietly. "They'll know the satisfaction of work well done, the security of being truly loved, and the freedom to choose their own path in life," Clara added. As darkness settled over the Wyoming territory, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been Clara Beaumont, wealthy, protected, but ultimately powerless to control her own destiny. Tonight, she was Clara Callahan, a woman who had chosen love over duty, freedom over security, and authentic happiness over artificial advantage. The quilt in her lap told the story of her transformation. Simple materials transformed through patient work into something beautiful and useful. Like her life, it was made not from expensive components, but from careful choices, steady effort, and the kind of love that found joy in everyday miracles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and build and create. But tonight, sitting on the porch of the home she had chosen with the man she loved, Clara Callahan was exactly where she belonged.